He said men don't cry, don't complain, and hit first. But in an old box I found letters that proved he'd been pretending to be someone else his whole life. I still remember the exact feeling of dirt under my fingernails. 10 years old, standing in our backyard with a shovel that felt twice my size, digging what seemed like my own grave while my grandfather watched from the porch. The hole had to be 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide. Perfect corners. If it wasn't perfect, I'd start over. That's how it always was with him. Everything had to be earned through pain, through proving I wasn't weak. When I scraped my knee falling off my bike, the tears barely had time to form before his hand cracked across my cheek. Real men don't cry over scratches. When I flinched during a thunderstorm, he'd make me stand outside until I stopped shaking. Fear was weakness, and weakness was the worst thing you could be. My parents worked double shifts just to keep our heads above water, so most afternoons were spent at his house. A small ranch-style place that smelled like cigarettes and disappointment. The walls were covered with military photos and hunting trophies, constant reminders of what real masculinity looked like according to him. He'd served in Vietnam, came back different according to my mom, but different in his case meant harder, colder, more demanding. Every mistake became a lesson in toughness. Drop a glass while helping with dishes? 20 push-ups. Cry during a scary movie? Sleep outside on the porch to toughen up. Show any emotion besides anger or stoic determination? That meant I was becoming soft, feminine, everything he despised. The belt came out more times than I can count, always accompanied by the same lecture about how the world would eat me alive if I didn't learn to be strong. The worst part wasn't even the physical stuff. It was the way he looked at me sometimes, like I was already a failure before I'd even had a chance to try. Like something about me disgusted him on a fundamental level. I started avoiding mirrors, started hunching my shoulders to take up less space, started apologizing for existing. By the time I hit middle school, I genuinely believed I was broken somehow, that whatever made someone a real man was missing from my DNA. School became another battlefield. I was small for my age, quiet, the kind of kid who preferred books to sports. Easy target. When bullies pushed me around, his voice echoed in my head telling me to fight back, to show them what I was made of. But every time I tried to follow his advice, I'd freeze up. The few times I actually threw a punch, it felt wrong, like I was playing a role that didn't fit. This just confirmed what I already suspected about myself. High school wasn't much better. I tried out for football thinking it might finally make him proud, but got cut during the first week. The coach said I didn't have the killer instinct. When I told my grandfather, he just shook his head and muttered something about his bloodline getting weaker with each generation. I spent that entire summer doing extra chores at his house, hoping to prove my worth through manual labor, but nothing I did ever seemed to measure up. Dating was a nightmare. The few girls who showed interest quickly lost it when they realized how anxious and uncertain I was about everything. I'd heard my grandfather's stories about his conquests, about how real men took what they wanted, but that approach felt disgusting to me. I wanted connection, conversation, tenderness. All the things he'd spent years training out of me. By senior year, I'd pretty much given up on the idea of relationships entirely. College offered some escape, but his voice followed me there too. Every time I felt overwhelmed by coursework or homesick or just plain sad, I'd hear him telling me to suck it up, that crying was for women. I developed this habit of staying up all night rather than admitting I needed help, pushing through exhaustion and stress because asking for support felt like admitting defeat. My grades suffered, my health suffered, but at least I wasn't being weak, right? The call came during my junior year. Heart attack, quick and massive. By the time I made it home, he was already gone. The funeral was exactly what you'd expect: military honors, closed casket, lots of talk about duty and service and strength. I stood there in my ill-fitting black suit, feeling nothing except maybe relief, which made me feel guilty all over again. My mom asked if I'd help clean out his house. My parents were dealing with legal stuff, and my younger sister was still in high school, so it fell to me. Walking through those rooms without his presence felt surreal. The cigarette smell was fading, and without his looming figure, the space seemed smaller, sadder somehow. Most of his belongings were exactly what you'd expect. Hunting gear, old uniforms, tools that looked like they'd never been used, books about war and survival. I was methodically sorting everything when I reached the back of his bedroom closet. Behind some mothballed winter coats, I found a wooden box I'd never seen before. It was locked, but the wood was old and the latch gave way easily. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was his, but younger, less harsh somehow. They were all addressed to the same person, Thomas. not a last name I recognized from our family or his army buddies. My hands were shaking as I opened the first one. The date put it sometime in the late 1960s, around the time he would have returned from Vietnam. The words on the page made my entire world tilt sideways. Update 1. I couldn't stop reading. Letter after letter, all in my grandfather's handwriting, all addressed to this Thomas person. They weren't just friendly correspondence, they were love letters. Deep, passionate, desperate love letters from a man I'd never imagined capable of such emotion. In one, he wrote about missing Thomas's laugh, about how the sound of it was the only thing that made the nightmares from the war quiet down. In another, he described their last night together before he'd shipped out, how they'd held each other until sunrise, both knowing it might be the last time. The pain in his words was raw, honest, nothing like the stoic man who'd raised me to believe emotions were weakness. But as I kept reading, the tone began to change. The letters became less frequent, more conflicted. He wrote about pressure from his family to settle down, about expectations and duty and what society demanded of men like him. There were mentions of dates with women, of trying to be what everyone expected him to be. The anguish practically bled through the paper. The final letter was dated just a few months before my grandmother's wedding announcement had appeared in the local paper. I remember seeing their wedding photo on his mantle my whole life, a young couple smiling stiffly in formal wear, looking more like business partners than lovers. Now I understood why. In that last letter, he wrote to Thomas about his decision to marry, to try to build a normal life. He called it the hardest choice he'd ever made, harder than anything he'd faced in combat. He wrote about loving Thomas but loving his family's approval more, about choosing fear over courage, convention over truth. The letter ended with an apology that felt like it had been ripped from his soul. I sat on his bedroom floor, surrounded by the debris of his hidden life, trying to reconcile this passionate, vulnerable man with the harsh disciplinarian who'd shaped my childhood. The same hands that had written these tender words had struck me countless times for showing the very emotions he'd poured onto these pages. But then I found something else in the box. Newspaper clippings from the 1970s and 80s, articles about gay rights protests and discrimination cases. Some were yellowed with age, others carefully preserved. There were also photos, candid shots of two men at what looked like private gatherings, always careful to maintain distance, to look like just friends to any outside observer. One of the men was unmistakably my grandfather, decades younger but with the same sharp features. The other must have been Thomas. The last photo was different. It showed the same two men, but they were older, grayer. They were sitting on a park bench, not touching but leaning toward each other in a way that spoke of deep familiarity. On the back, someone had written a date from just 5 years ago and a location, a park about 2 hours from our town. My mind reeled. Had they been meeting secretly all these years? While my grandfather was married to my grandmother, raising my mother, building this facade of traditional masculinity, had he been living this double life? I thought about my grandmother then, about her quiet sadness that I'd always attributed to just being married to such a difficult man. Had she known? Had she spent decades pretending not to see what was right in front of her? The thought made my chest tight with a pain I couldn't name. Update 2. I couldn't let it go. The photos, the letters, the decades of deception, it consumed me for weeks. I'd wake up thinking about it, go to bed with questions spinning through my head. Finally, I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I Googled Thomas, using clues from the letters and photos to track him down. He was still alive, living in a retirement community about 3 hours away. I drove there on a Saturday, not really sure what I planned to say or why I even needed to meet him. The facility was nice, one of those places with manicured gardens and residents who looked like they'd lived comfortable lives. When I asked for Thomas at the front desk, the woman's face lit up. She said he didn't get many visitors and would probably be thrilled to have company. She directed me to the garden area, where I found an elderly man feeding birds from a bench. Even aged and frail, I recognized him from the photos. I approached carefully, introduced myself as my grandfather's grandson. The change in his expression was immediate and heartbreaking. His face crumpled, and for a moment I thought he might cry. Instead, he invited me to sit, and we talked for almost 3 hours. Thomas told me things about my grandfather that I'd never imagined. How gentle he'd been before the war, how the trauma had hardened him but hadn't changed his core kindness, at least not with Thomas. How they continued meeting throughout the decades, stolen afternoons and out-of-the-way places where two old friends could sit together without raising suspicion. But Thomas also told me about the guilt my grandfather carried, the self-hatred that had eaten at him for choosing safety over love. how he'd become increasingly bitter as the years passed, especially as society began to change and accept what he'd been too afraid to embrace. Thomas said my grandfather had talked about me sometimes, about his grandson who reminded him too much of his younger self. That's when the final piece clicked into place. My grandfather hadn't been trying to toughen me up. He'd been trying to save me from becoming what he saw as his greatest failure. Every harsh word, every punishment, every lesson in traditional masculinity had been his twisted attempt to spare me from the pain he'd lived with his entire life. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He'd seen his own sensitivity, his own capacity for tenderness, his own difference in me, and it had terrified him. Not because he hated those qualities, but because he knew firsthand what the world did to men who possessed them. In his mind, he was protecting me the only way he knew how, by beating those traits out of me before life could punish me for them. Thomas reached over and squeezed my hand with his weathered fingers. He told me my grandfather had died regretting many things, but that his biggest regret wasn't the life he'd lived in secret. It was the damage he'd done to the people he loved while trying to hide it. I drove home in a daze, my entire understanding of my childhood, my family, myself completely restructured. The man who terrorized me with his demands for toughness had been living as the very thing he tried to train out of me. Someone who loved differently, who felt deeply, who didn't fit the narrow definition of masculinity he'd spent his life enforcing. Final update. It's been 6 months since I found those letters, since I met Thomas, since my world got turned upside down. I wish I could say it immediately healed all the damage from my childhood, but trauma doesn't work that way. Understanding the source of someone's cruelty doesn't erase the impact it had on you. But something has shifted. The voice in my head that sounded like my grandfather, the one that criticized every emotion and questioned every tear, has gotten quieter. Not gone, probably never gone, but less powerful. When I feel overwhelmed now, I don't automatically hate myself for it. When I want to cry, I sometimes actually let myself. I've started dating again, something I'd given up on years ago. It's messy and awkward, and I still carry all this baggage about what it means to be a man, but I'm trying. The woman I've been seeing is patient with my awkwardness, seems to actually appreciate the parts of me my grandfather tried so hard to eliminate. She likes that I think before I speak, that I ask how she's feeling, that I'm not afraid to admit when I don't know something. I went back to visit Thomas a few weeks ago. We developed an unlikely friendship, bonded by our shared connection to a man who shaped both our lives in different ways. He's teaching me things about my grandfather that help me understand not just him, but myself. Stories about the man he was before fear took over, before he decided that love was too dangerous to pursue openly. Thomas showed me more photos from their secret meetings over the years. In the later ones, my grandfather looks tired, worn down by decades of pretending. But when he's looking at Thomas, there's something in his eyes I never saw at home. Peace, maybe, or just the relief of being able to drop the mask for a few hours. I think about my grandmother too, gone now for almost a decade. Thomas confirmed what I'd suspected. She knew, or at least strongly suspected. But she'd made her own choice to live with the pretense, to build a life around the edges of my grandfather's secret. I wonder if she resented it, or if she found her own form of contentment in their arrangement. I'll never know for sure, but I'm trying to have compassion for all of them, trapped as they were by the times they lived in and the expectations that shaped their choices. The hardest part has been figuring out how to feel about my grandfather himself. For so long, my relationship with his memory was simple. He was the man who'd made my childhood miserable, who'd convinced me I was fundamentally flawed. Now I see him as something more complicated, a victim of his own fear and his era's limitations, someone who'd caused tremendous damage while drowning in his own pain. I can't forgive him entirely. The scared little boy who lived inside me for so many years deserves to have his suffering acknowledged. But I can understand him now in a way that's allowed me to stop carrying his shame as my own. His inability to accept himself doesn't mean there was anything wrong with me. His fear doesn't have to become my prison. I kept one of the letters, the one where he writes about choosing fear over love. I read it sometimes when I catch myself falling back into old patterns, when I start to believe that vulnerability is weakness or that real men don't feel deeply. It reminds me that strength isn't about hiding who you are. It's about having the courage to be yourself even when the world tells you that self isn't acceptable. My grandfather spent his entire life trying to be someone he wasn't, and it poisoned everything he touched. I refuse to make the same mistake. I'm still learning how to be comfortable in my own skin, how to trust my instincts instead of his voice, how to love without apology. It's hard work, undoing decades of conditioning, but for the first time in my life, it feels possible. Thomas is helping me plan something that would have horrified my grandfather, but feels right to me. We're going to plant a small garden in the park where they used to meet, nothing dramatic or public, just a quiet space where beauty can grow from the ashes of their hidden love story. It won't bring my grandfather back or undo the damage he caused, but it feels like a way to honor the part of him that was real, the part that loved deeply even if he never had the courage to live that love openly. I'm learning that healing isn't about forgetting or forgiving everything that happened to you. It's about understanding the difference between the wounds that belong to you and the ones that were passed down by people too broken to know better. My grandfather's shame was never mine to carry. His fear doesn't have to become my legacy. The little boy who used to dig holes in the backyard, desperate to prove his worth to a man who couldn't even prove it to himself, finally understands that he was enough all along. The sensitivity my grandfather tried to beat out of me wasn't a flaw to be fixed. It was the very thing that could have saved us both, if only he'd been brave enough to embrace it instead of fear it. I still have bad days, moments when his voice gets loud again, and I question everything about myself. But now I have other voices too. Thomas telling me stories about love that transcended fear, my girlfriend reminding me that gentleness is a strength, my own heart finally learning to trust that who I am is exactly who I'm supposed to be. The box of letters sits on my bookshelf now, a reminder of secrets that destroyed one generation but freed the next. I won't let his story end with shame and regret. I'll live the authentic life he was too afraid to claim, love openly what he could only love in shadow, and maybe that will be enough to break the cycle of fear that shaped us both.